I'll just hand it off to Alex. But before I do that, a little bit about him, our speaker today. Alex is the CTO of Leonid Systems, which he founded in 2007. And as a CTO, he is responsible for leading the development of new products in the cloud communication space. Prior to that, he held various positions in management, consulting, and sales engineering at startups and non-startups. He came to the Valley as a Stanford student. So he will be talking about creating new products, a case study.
Nice.
All right, Alex.
Thanks for having me. Can you guys hear me in the back? Is it all right? Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me. I'm very happy to be here. Tell me a little bit about yourselves for starters. How many of you guys are in what you would call B2b, products that you sell to other businesses? And how many of you are in B2C, stuff for consumers? And then, okay, good, got it, thanks. And how many of you are in software? And how many of you are in hardware infrastructure? Okay, that's a good mix about that, okay. So, my name is Alex Cowan. I run a company called Leonid Systems where I'm the CTO, and Leonid builds software for communication service providers, companies like Verizon, France Telecom, people like that. And I'm also the author of a book called Starting a Tech Business. Starting a Tech Business is about taking your ideas and actualizing them and bringing them to life, and that's what we're going to talk about today. My big area of interest is there's all these ideas out there: Agile, design thinking, customer development, and these things are almost universally well liked. You know, everybody, very few people argue about whether these are good or bad, and yet there's this amazing void between theory and practice. Very few people actually doing all these things, especially all these things, to a very large degree. So that's strange. Why is that? That's really my main area of interest, is understanding that, and more importantly, thinking about practical ways to help people go and institute those ideas and make use of them in their companies. Let's talk about you guys for a second, because I don't want you to get bored. I'm assuming a few things about you. One is that you have the desire to go out and launch new ideas. And two, I'm not assuming you have any particular technical knowledge. And thirdly, I'm assuming that you want to take action, that you want to learn things here today, that you can go into the office and apply tomorrow. Is that reasonable? Because I don't want to waste your time, make you bored. Okay. All right, so these are 4 big areas that we're going to talk about. And what we're going to talk about in this concepts module is kind of the old way that things were and more appropriate replacements for these things, particularly for companies that are developing new products, things where they haven't yet completely ascertained what they're going to create and who they're going to sell it to, and why those things have what people usually call product market fit. Ideation is the process of pulling your ideas together conceptually and making them successful. And before, you had this idea of self-love. How many of you worked in the Valley during the dot-com period? Yeah, but I mean, we were on quite a tear. People, there was a lot of money around, and people went and built things that they thought everybody would like. And what's kind of replaced this idea of self-love is a concept called design thinking, which is a very general rubric, but it effectively means deploying a high degree of empiricism and empathy to your observations about customers, and then applying that in a very directed way, that creatively. So, I got a question from somebody before the meeting. Why is design thinking a new term or an old term? And it seems like a perfectly good idea. Why doesn't everybody do this? And I think that there's a couple different reasons. One is the idea of self-love, the idea that you stick to your guns and your idea is your baby. You vet it till the end, bitter or sweet or whatever. In some ways, it's a very classical idea. How many people know the quote from Henry Ford about, if I asked people what they wanted, you know it?
Yeah.
What would they say they wanted?
Faster horse.
Faster horse. Faster horse. He also said the thing about the black car.
Yeah.
But in this case, it's the horse question. So this idea of sticking to your guns is a very classical idea in some ways. Also, I think that, and this is something we're going to talk about, how to avoid this, people like to measure their efficiency very locally. If I finish a talk and I put it together, I feel I'm psyched. I'm done. I'm going to have a beer and watch Homeland or take it easy. And if my publicist or more importantly an audience tells me the talk really sucks, you kind of need to pull it apart and redo it again, I don't want to hear that. Now I got to go back and do more work, and the work that I did was silly. So I think that's the other reason some of these things there's some kind of mental resistance to these things. But if you do these things, they'll actually help you avoid those mistakes, and you'll use your time and everybody else's time much more efficiently. Design thinking has basically two pillars, empathy and creativity. It's fundamentally a very simple set of ideas. So this is a seamstress that you see here, and a seamstress, she's sewing, but they spend a lot of time cutting things. And how many of you picked up a pair of sewing scissors, cut something with them? They're fantastic, right? I mean, compared to regular scissors, your hand slips right into them. It's very natural. You can sit there and cut things. So somebody who knew about seamstresses created sewing scissors at some point. And I'm sure they were much, much better than what everybody had before. And the idea with design thinking is, especially for high tech, is that there's some ready-made techniques that some of you may already be familiar with that you can use to apply these things. The first one is personas. How many of you guys use personas in your work today, develop personas? Okay, a lot of you, okay. And does this look like how does this look to you guys as a persona? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I would give it a thumbs down.
What's the question?
Does this look like a good persona to you? If you're one of your staff walked in and said, here's a persona I created for the new product we're going to create.
Oh.
Thumbs down. Thumbs down. Yeah. Look, this looks like it came off the internet. These are bullet points. It looks like these last two items here are responses to a questionnaire. And so the key thing about developing personas, and a lot of these techniques we use with design thinking, is that it's really important to get out and really observe your customers and your users in kind of their natural environment in an unprompted way. And there's a funny story. Does anybody know the yellow Walkman story about Sony? So Sony's doing a focus group, and everyone knows what Walkman is still, right? That's older folks here. So they have this yellow Walkman that they've created. So they pull in a focus group, and they say, we're thinking of making this yellow Walkman. What do you think? And everybody said, oh, it's terrific. It's so much funner, more interesting, and sporty than the black Walkmans that you had before. And they finished this focus group, and somebody had the foresight to put two piles of Walkmans on the tables outside the door. When everybody was leaving, they were allowed to take one. Nobody took the yellow Walkman. It's shocking. Every single person in the focus group lied to the moderator. Wow, that's not a very good result, is it? Not a very good use of Sony's dwindling money. So you have to ask yourself, well, what do you do instead? This is a somewhat better persona. Okay, this photo was taken with an iPhone. It's not important that the stuff looks great. It's important that it's vivid and that it's descriptive. And you can see this description. There's some things in here that, on the surface of them are pretty irrelevant to maybe what we're going to build for this person. But the point with a good persona is that you're writing a short story about this person. You're writing a eulogy for them like they're your best friend. You know this person inside and out in a very detailed way. It doesn't matter, 27% of them play video games, 5% of them, walk to school on one foot. What matters is a very vivid description of these people. That's what's really important about creating a good persona. The second thing we have is stories. How many of you guys use user stories? User stories are very well suited to the practical application of design thinking, but kind of the reverse isn't necessarily true. Just because you write user stories doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be good. I mean, it's probably better than writing requirements or something like that, but this same practice of empiricism and this starting point of having a very vivid persona as your starting point for writing those stories is very, very important. You guys probably know the three portions of a user story. The interesting thing I find when I'm working with my own staff at Leonid, and I'm working with companies I mentor, is that it's usually this last clause in the user story that gets left out, because it's pretty self-evident. I'm a mom and I want to blah, whatever. Okay, this is pretty intuitive. But it's actually that last item that's the most important, because that's how you're establishing the relevance of the story. And you're making sure that you're stating to whoever's looking at the story and to yourself, why do you really think that this person wants to do this? Because if you don't do that with your user stories, you just might as well be writing requirements or any other old thing. You're really not helping yourself very much. So the organization of stories, somebody was telling me they still write PRDs to supplement their stories, and I've heard that more than once. We don't do that at Leonid, but I can see the reasons why that would happen. We try to use the 3 tiers of organization for stories. So we have epic stories about kind of an arc, what people want to do, sub-stories within them, and then we supplement those with test cases. How many of you organize your stories with these 3 tiers in mind? Oh, not for me. That's interesting. Okay. So we're going to go through some examples of this, but the nice thing about stories, and one good way to allow them to provide you the structure that you can get with something like a PRD is to use these 3 tiers and use those or keep your stories organized and highly structured. So the thing about design thinking, conceptually, to take away is that you don't have to have a closet full of black sweaters. You don't have to smoke cigarettes. You don't have to own a scooter. You don't even have to own a Macintosh. Everybody can practice design thinking. It's very intuitive. The most important thing is to have the desire to produce something that people really like. So the next item we have is planning. And before, we had the 5-year plan. How many of you guys operate on 5-year plans? Oh, that's interesting for a few. Good. I mean, the 5-year plan was something, at least I had to do when I was in a startup in the .com period. I think the 5-year plans were actually invented by Lenin, communists, originally to plan socialism, and they're very, very, very poorly suited to a startup, because you obviously don't have that kind of foresight, and so the replacement for this idea of iterative management is recently popularized in the Lean Startup, which Eric Ries wrote, and the nice thing about that and that idea of managing things that way is that what classically happens, you have this 5-year plan, and if you're on the management team, like I was in a couple situations, you have to create this thing for the VC, and then you have to dust it off every quarter or two to go to a board meeting and create some kind of elaborate story about how what's actually happening is somehow conforms back to this 5-year plan that you created, which is difficult. It's kind of an interesting exercise, but very, very wasteful, really, from a business standpoint. And yet, and what effectively happens, it's funny, no plan at all is equally unmanageable, but that's often effectively what happens when people write a 5-year plan, because nobody's really paying attention to it. So the great thing, it's very appropriate to high tech, and probably everybody knows this stuff, is that plain old science was a terrific standby for these things the whole time. So in the scientific method, we get an idea, and in product development, we ask ourselves, do we have compelling empirical evidence from our work on these personas that this is interesting to my buyer or my user? And then we create a hypothesis, which is just a set of assumptions that you can prove or disprove with a set of experiments. Then you identify whether your experimental design is going to give you provable or disprovable data. You carry it out. And this is a great thing, because particularly in a startup, or I think any company these days, really, you have this very difficult pairing of urgency and uncertainty. As a manager, I think that's one of the hardest situations to be in. And I think all startups and many companies are under a lot of pressure to get new stuff out the door. Having these assumptions laid out, using them as a managerial focal point to drive towards is a great way to keep everybody focused on a very obvious set of objectives that nobody has to go into a meeting and waste time arguing about. You get your analysis and your conclusion, and then in the Lean Startup terms, you either pivot and you say, look, we disprove this. We're going to face facts, look at the data, and acknowledge that we disproved the thing that we were hoping was true. Or you say, this looks good, let's scale this up and start spending more money on it. And the tools to actually do this are quite simple. At Leonid, we just use this simple table like this. So every assumption has a priority, and you obviously want to take the assumptions that are most important and easiest to prove, and you want to make those your top priorities that you work on proving out, then each of these is going to have a question of, does this need to be proven? And this is an important thing. Just because an assumption is important doesn't mean that it has to be proven. It also doesn't mean you shouldn't lay it out. And the last thing is you have your experimentation, which you want to reference. Obviously, this could be quite a lot more complicated, and you may write this up somewhere else. So this is, a pretty simple tool, very, 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 very easy to publish inside your organization, everybody, so they can see it. So let's look at a couple examples here. Parents want an app, hypothetically, to organize the distribution of allowances. Yes, we need to prove that. That parents have smartphones, no, we do not need to prove that. It's important that we lay it out and we acknowledge that it's a pivotal assumption, but we don't need to go prove it. How many of you are familiar with Alex Osterwalder's business model canvas? Okay. This is an increasingly, he's actually with the same group at Wiley, this is an increasingly popular tool for, okay, if we're not going to write the 5-year plan, what takes its place? So I think this is a very good tool, and we're going to go over an example in the next module for laying out the key aspects of your business or your particular division inside the business and making sure they all make sense together and making sure that you and your collaborators have a shared understanding of what the business actually is and what's important. And the last tool is a financial model. And how many of you as product managers are obliged to run the numbers around product investments? Okay, so maybe a third of you. The thing that I see, I work with a lot of startups as well, and the thing that I see them doing a lot, which I try to help them avoid, is on the financial model, you want your focus to be kind of bimodal. You want to be very, very, very focused on the short term so that you know you're not going to run out of money or exceed your budget. And then you want to have a very parametric view of the long term, because once you understand your unit economies, you want to be able to extrapolate out what does this business look like at scale, this scale, that scale. What you don't want to spend your time on is what I call the gunky middle. Like, what will this look like in 2 years? And I'm going to put all these fancy, complicated inputs into this. It's kind of like if I asked you, what's going to be the temperature tomorrow in Santa Clara? You could all look on your iPhones or whatever you have, and you can tell me with pretty reasonable certainty what it's going to be. But if I asked you, what's it going to be out to 3 significant digits? I mean, there's really no amount of calculating or extrapolating or research that you could do to get a better answer. And that's what you want to avoid with this. So these are the 3 tools that I recommend to kind of, people ask me a lot, and kind of this is my focal area, how do I actually do what they described in the Lean Startup? I think that these 3 tools are the best places to start, organize yourself in that manner. And they're very, very transparent and very straightforward and completely, totally free and on the internet. So the next item we have is organization. So before, we had this thing called aping. And if you were in a startup, and I know not many of you are not, but if you're in a startup or you're in a small organization within a big organization that hasn't ascertained a product market fit, you're working on a new product, there's this habit of aping, which was, hey, well, we'll make this little company, this startup, or this little organization a big organization by behaving like a big organization. It's kind of like the Jungle Book, And this never came true because, and this was really the big realization about this rubric of customer development, a startup or any part of a company that's working on a new product where they have not yet ascertained their product market fit is not a small version of a big company, it's a fundamentally different animal because they're not working to scale something that's already understood, they're working to discover something about their customers and their products that's not yet understood. And it was an interesting thing at Lean that we've been working on because we now have quite a lot of products where we do have that product market fit, and what we do is we actually run these 2 models simultaneously. So we have a relatively traditional departmental-driven, process-driven organization. Sales sells stuff, development builds it, operations deploys and supports it, and that works well. Because the other flip side of customer development, a common misunderstanding that I hear is, well, having processes and all that stuff is bad. That's absolutely not true. I mean, there's plenty of startups or new business units that fall on their face because they don't have that process. So it's just that it doesn't make sense when you have not ascertained that product market fit. So the substitute is you have this idea of a customer development team who is small, has different skill sets, but is run without a lot of formal structure. They work in very small batches, and they're fundamentally suited for going out, getting their hands dirty, working with customers, and ascertaining that product market fit. And so we actually do that at Lean. We actually run both of those models. So we have, when we're rolling out new things, we actually have a customer development team that has consultants, it has an engineer, it has a customer management person, and they actually just work together in a very loose fashion. We have a certain amount of money, we're going to invest in this. We're usually have an agreement with a customer, we get paid on that, but we fundamentally recognize that we're going to be running that not in the same way that we run our mainline development. We actually run those two models simultaneously. How many of you all have a different type of organization for when you're introducing new products versus the stuff that you got that's your mainline stuff that you build inside your company? Very few. Okay, yeah. This is a kind of a novel idea, and it's as a manager, it's harder to do this, because it's harder to have two totally different. Yes. Oh, I can't hear you. Yep. Yep.
But how do you transition companies from that traditional model, which tends to be a little more hands-off,
That's a good question. The question was, you do this. You're running both of these models simultaneously. This sort of traditional, departmentally driven, process-driven model, and you're running a customer development team to introduce a new product. How do you once they hit that product market fit and they're starting to scale, how do you transition over to the other model? I think it depends on a couple of things. I mean, the short answer is, well, you just do. You kind of have the process already, and you have them start following that. But I think that the interesting questions, and this is really going to depend on the situation, is do you continue to use that same team because they know this thing and they kind of roll into a more traditional structure, or do you kind of just shovel the stuff over into your regular organization that does this stuff? And I can't say that I think that there is a very reliable answer there, company to company. I think it depends a lot on a particular mix of people, product, situation, things like that. That's a good. That question I can answer. When we transition them from this one organization to the more traditional thing, they complained because they had a lot more attention before, and they were getting a lot more personalized service because they were like the first customer. No easy answer to that. It's an account management situation where they've gotten a terrific deal, and if they want to pay for this sort of premium service, they can, but ultimately you have to make your economics work. You have to kind of work with them and help them understand that. Hopefully you have talented account management people who can manage to do that. Yes?
It's a really interesting question. Do you allow the people who are on that small team to decide whether they want to stay with the product or stay in the front end, small group sort of environment?
Yeah.
So do you have some of the individuals?
We don't do. We move the stuff over because our stuff tends to be functionally relatively similar. So we move it over to our mainline organization. But like I said, I can't give you a very always do this type of answer on that one because I think it just depends on so many things.
So for you transfer the product.
Yeah, that's what we do. Okay, so let's look at kind of how this stuff works for a startup, which it's pretty much the same thing inside a company. I mean, you got a lot of you've gotten money from your board or your business unit. A lot of things are the same, but this particular example is based on a startup. So our founders get a great new idea. They create a 5-year plan that shows 10x returns because that's what you have to do if you want to go talk to a traditional VC. It's just part of the act. And this has a chain of assumptions that's so tenuous that it's more likely that they win the lottery or also get captured by aliens. Almost anything can happen except actually realizing this 5-year plan, even if they're successful, as it's been laid out. So let's say they get the money from the VCs. They're in an exciting space. VCs want to be in it. The VCs, most of them are in a scale business themselves, so they want to put a lot of capital to work, and they want to bring in these executives that they know, and they want to get their neighbor who works at a black shoe law firm to be your attorney, and you all of a sudden you have all these expenses, and but yeah, you have money sitting around, So the problem is that it's not that people who work at big companies won't do a good job, it's just that they've been learning how to scale something that's relatively well understood, and that's been their mission for so long that they won't always transition well to a small company environment where the mission, it's not incrementally different, it's fundamentally different. The things you have to do when you walk into the office in the morning, the way you have to interact with people when you're ascertaining a product market fit are just so fundamentally different than the things that you do when you're trying to scale and manage a big organization. That's where I think that kind of talent runs into trouble. So the new hires come in, where's my assistant? What's happening here? They're looking to put their established recipes to work, but they don't have this experience in hands-on discovery and empiricism. The expanded team is working to conform to this 5-year plan. It's not happening. They're making up these elaborate fictions to go talk to the board about, and you can kind of see where this is headed. So it doesn't work out very well. Let's look at how this works if we do the things we've described here. So our founders get this idea inside their company or as a new startup. The first thing they do is they lay out, presumably they've already gone out and talked to customers, understood them, created personas. They lay out all their key assumptions, the first thing that they do. And they're focused on asking themselves, do we need to go raise money to prove the rest of these out? Or can we just do this ourselves before we go raise money? Because certainly you should try to prove them out yourself before you go raise money if you can within a reasonable amount of time and effort. So they get this collection of certain of the assumptions. This is going to reduce, though, the amount of capital they need to go raise because they've organized themselves in a way where they're not all of a sudden trying to build this big, huge company from the get-go, which is mostly going to be totally wasted, right? Because you don't need a sales department, you don't need a marketing department, you don't need a product management department. You kind of need a department that does all those things in support of discovering something about the customer. And if you go do those things, you're just going to be wasting money. A great example I see with startups a lot is a non-technical founder gets an idea and they're like, okay, well, I've got to get a developer. So I'm going to go get a developer, and they're paying them or they're friends and it's goodwill. And the biggest mistake they make is they started to build something before they really know what they want to build. So they've wasted money or they've wasted goodwill, and they're having to retread and go back and kind of try to get some more treasure because they spent a bunch of it. So our investors are approached, or maybe these guys just do friends and family because they don't need all that much money. That's what we did at Lean. We've never raised venture capital before. This leaves them free to bring in the resources that they want, and this focused on this key assumptions gives them nice, clear, visible company-wide priorities to execute against. They're focused on that. The roles and the success criteria for everybody is very, very clear and transparent. They're validating these assumptions. They're driving towards this pivot or persevere moment where they prove or disprove their assumptions. And when they go talk to their board, which could just be themselves or maybe an advisor they brought on because they wanted to, they have a shared set of conclusions and empirical data they can look at and say, okay, well, were we right or were we wrong about this? And as you can see, this works out a lot better. The worst thing that happens is that you learn a whole bunch of stuff about how to build a product. So the last one we're going to talk about is development. So you guys have probably heard the whole spiel about how awful Waterfall is and how terrific Agile is a million times. Don't worry, I'm not going to go on a tirade about that and bore you guys. What I think is really notable about this, and it's important because it's important to understand how these things fit together, is that the inputs to Agile are personas and stories. And what I see a lot of, especially larger companies, is they write user stories because that's part of what you're supposed to do with Agile, and they're kind of get shoveled over, and a lot of the time the product management or whoever it is supposed to be learning about the customer really isn't interacting with engineering all that much in discussions and iterations and things. So it's kind of this thing where it's like, well, engineering is going to do Agile, but they don't want the business people in their hair, so it's all kind of at arm's length. And so the linkage between these things is extremely important. And the practice of design thinking as the primary input into the Agile process, I think, at least at Lean, and for us, is what primarily makes it worthwhile and successful. So I think that the other thing that I hear a lot about Agile is that, it's complicated, there's this orthodoxy, does the Scrum Master zig or do they zag? I think one thing that's important to understand, which probably a lot of you know in your profession, is that the Agile Manifesto itself is very brief, and it's only 6 to 8 words, and it says we value these interactions over tools, we value software over documentation, collaboration over contracts, and responding to change over following an arbitrary plan. So I think that the most important thing is to keep Agile kind of to its fundamentals. The most important things are right here, and they're very visible and they're very easy to understand and apply. So I think that probably you guys have all experienced this, but it's important to recognize that a lot of Agile, a lot of software is just built for internal audiences. And so there's this idea that, well, there's somebody out there, a product owner, who knows all the answers about how this thing should work. And that's a little bit different when you're in a situation where you're ascertaining a product market fit, you're building a brand new product, because that person doesn't exist. It's somebody's job, presumably the product owner, to go out and actually go collect that data and bring it back, feed it into the development process. So on your past iteration, you're going out, and your job as the product owner is to validate what you guys have done with customers, because don't pretend that you know that it's right if you haven't really ascertained that product market fit yet. The second thing is the present iteration, you're collaborating, you're hopefully discussing these stories and these personas, and then in the future iteration, you're pairing the assumptions about what you're going to build with the user stories or whatever other description you're using that the engineering team is going to consume. And that's really important, because obviously if you don't have that set of assumptions about why you think you should go build X, you're not going to, when you loop back to here, you're not going to have a good idea about how to go prove or disprove that what you did was right. So in summary on these concepts, we have, from design thinking, direction, personas, and user stories interact with customer development, iterative management, through this idea of laying out all your assumptions, pairing them with the things that you've gone out and learned about your users and your customers. And then customer development gives you a very appropriate set of roles and delineations about how people should work together that's distinct from a traditional organization. Agile gives you working product in small batches, hopefully, for doing it somewhere along the lines of the normal way. And then this allows you to validate very frequently that what you've done is actually worthwhile or not worthwhile. I get a lot of questions from people in the product management role about how do I actually take all these ideas and go apply them at my company, because again, my area of interest is, I'm not going to sell you guys that these are good things. Almost everybody loves these general ideas, but very few people practice them fully. So I put together 6 tips, and a couple of you, Vinay was one person, a couple of you sent me questions before, and thank you very much. I actually used those when I was formulating these. So the first tip is just go do this. Don't ask for permission. Don't try to figure out if it's your job or marketing's job or what. Just go start doing some of these things. We're going to talk about some very practical ways to spend a very reasonable amount of time and get started. The second thing is show, don't sell. There's no point in saying, look, we need to do design thinking or we need to do iterative management. Just start doing it. Start bringing a set of assumptions to meetings. There's nothing wrong. You're not going to get in trouble. And make the things work on a very day-to-day type of basis. And we never get to do everything we want to do professionally. At least we never get to finish it. I certainly don't. So it's very important to identify something where you think that using these tools is going to have an identifiable impact, and focus on that. Find a beachhead, focus on that, start doing these things on a beachhead. Then you want to make sure you broadcast this stuff. Does everybody, you started writing personas up. Does everybody know where those are? Are they on your Google Docs or your intranet or your shared drive or whatever? If you go to a meeting, let people know where this stuff is so they can see what you're doing. Because the best way to prove this stuff in is on a very incremental, day-to-day basis. Not a big huge change. The next thing is, look at making yourself agile. There's a lot of interest in applying these ideas outside of core engineering. Organize your work into iterations. There's a post on my website, alexandercowan.com. We use a thing in Lean called the Daily Do, which kind of ties back to how many of you do Agile daily stand-ups? A lot of you. So I would just, a lot of our team members are in various places. So, for my direct reports, we just write an email saying, what did I accomplish yesterday? What am I going to do today? What things are impeding my progress? Works great. It's fantastic. Really, really good. Tool keeps everybody from getting bugged. And the last thing is just, focus on yourself if you're having trouble getting your organization to do these things, because if you do that and you're executing really well, everything else is ultimately going to fall into place. Don't wait for the last judgment, because it just happens every day. So those are some concepts. Now I'm going to take you guys through an example of a B2B company, which is, I think, the general domain that most of you guys are in, Lean Systems, where I work, and how we actually go do these things, and some specific examples. Because I think that these concepts are important. It's important to understand them in a consumable, practical way. But I think that the focus of a lot of Steve Blank's work and Eric Ries's work has been on consumer applications in a lot of cases, and so I think there's a little bit of a dearth of examples in B2B. So that's why I brought this example to you guys. So my story with Leonid is that in 2007, I left a company called Broadsoft, which built a voice application server to pursue some new ideas about the delivery of various cloud services, mostly around communications, to operators, companies like Verizon, France Telecom, people like that. These guys have kind of two hemispheres. One is the network, and that's where Broadsoft was, as a company that makes an application server, this thing that does voice services and web collaboration things that folks like Verizon, France Telecom can put in their network and then go sell services against. This was the hemisphere they're on, and there's lots of fantastic equipment in this area. Things were great. There's all sorts of neat things these operators could do to modernize their franchises. The problem was the IT side, which is basically just enterprise software, was really lagging behind. These systems were very old and creaky, and so I left to go pursue consulting and IT. Consulting is another thing that's big in this general space. Consulting services around creating cool services that make sense together, redesigning processes so that the operators have a way to go pursue these new lines of business, and integration and customization to stitch all this together. So I was running the professional services business at Broadsoft, so this was kind of a monkey bar thing to start with consulting, which is what we did, rather than a big leap. And that's how we got started. But then what we did is we took the things that we learned in the consulting business and the money that we put together, and that's how we started building software. And that was not easy, and we did not know what we were going to build in advance. And it's a story of how we did that at Leonid that we're going to use for the ideation section here. So first thing I did was totally screw up and waste a whole bunch of money. And I built a product called Prometheus, which was a business intelligence tool that mined various network elements and showed the operators what services their users were using and how often they were using them. And it was like really hard to do, and I thought it would be so cool because it would allow the operators to empirically learn about what was working for them, and we would be rewarded for our hard work and ingenuity and effort. And then nobody bought it. I was like, oh, it's terrible, So the problem was, it was the middle of the recession, so this stuff wasn't on their A list, and they were kind of looking for us to give them advice on service design anyway. So we redesigned Prometheus with some stuff that we had validated they really wanted, and then more importantly, I'd kind of learned, look, I really need to validate the relative importance of this stuff and the details as we move forward. And then we built 3 more products, which were very successful for us. The first one, we had this practice called service design, where we went out, operators, and we helped them take all these different network elements and package them into really great cloud services that were sellable for them and compelling and the users liked. And one thing we kept running into is the product manager, usually the business owner, couldn't create the self-care experience on the web that they wanted. And that sort of is the product, at least from an interface standpoint with the cloud service. So this was a huge problem. This was kind of a blocker. But fortunately, there were some architectures available that allowed us to build something that was a product, and it did all this stuff, and it provided a great Web 2.0 experience out of the box, and yet was very customizable for them. So they kind of got their cake and they got to eat it too. And that's a product we call Loki Portals. And we built Loki Portals around an analysis of what we learned on the consulting side and the creation of some personas. The obvious personas here are, what do the end users want to do? What does the product manager want to be able to do with this? But we also focused on some non-obvious personas, like the person that was actually going to take this product and use our development toolkit to customize the front end. And we made sure that we spent a lot of time with those people, and we made sure that the toolkit itself was very audience appropriate. And that was in some ways kind of a non-obvious thing to do, at least to spend that level of effort understanding that person, but that paid off in a huge way. This made a huge difference on the ability of the operator to just get stuff done, use this toolkit to go and deploy things. So I think, I was asked, well, it's all design thinking stuff really makes sense for B2B, for enterprises. I think it absolutely does. There's more personas at play. You're closer to them. You're much more adjacent. You're able to go talk to them relatively easily. And I think that focusing on the non-obvious actors that interact with the system can often give you a huge amount of advantage over your competitors in kind of non-obvious ways. There's another example. We do this work in business process design. We're seeing that it was taking the people in the back office like hours and hours to set up even a small office of, say, 40 people. And so, kind of the obvious thing to do was to just automate this and, create a tool. There were lightweight architectures available to do that. And we did that with a product called Loki Provision. So they put in a very small amount of inputs, and we do all the complicated things to set these up. From a development standpoint, that was trivial. One of our guys could have built this thing in like a week, and so could any of our competitors. What was really interesting about this product, and the reason why it's still a great franchise for us, is that we spent a ton of time watching what these back office people actually did. Where do they fall down? Where do they make mistakes? And in the boring business of enterprise software, I think that can give you an enormous competitive advantage. It's funny, as a friend of mine is a UX designer, and she was doing engagements years ago at a large enterprise software company that I won't name. And she was like, this was the toughest job and the easiest job I ever had because these people didn't want me there. They loved that the software sucked and that you had to have an army of consultants in to get it working and usable. That was part of the model, but I think that's changing. So how many of you are in enterprise software? Quite a few of you. So I think there's that interesting change now to where usability is no longer this thing that you can get away with kind of sweeping under the rug. Big operators getting subsumed by smaller, more focused operators that are doing all this stuff. They're doing a better job on usability. They are more attentive to learning about all the different personas and users that are at play with their audiences. So the last thing that is, we were doing these process design engagements. We were seeing that all the things that we wanted to do with our partners to redesign their business, they were running into trouble with their the CRM, order management, billing, all these systems that were in play. So we built a platform called Loki BPM on top of Sugar CRM, and then we did a version on Salesforce.com. And this was a fairly obvious thing to do, and we had all the knowledge we needed to do it, but what we spent an enormous amount of time on, and really what was the product, because enterprise software, it's like Play-Doh, it's very easy to make it do something. You're not splitting the atom. It's really about knowing what the stuff should do. We spent a huge amount of time on probably almost a dozen personas that we learned about through these business process design engagements. It took an enormous amount of time and effort up front. But I don't see how we possibly could have been successful with Loki BPM, at least as a packaged product, without doing that.
So what's the frequency with which it's a continuous process of building personas, or you're doing
Yep. We keep on. The question was, so it's a continuous process of building these personas. Yeah, it absolutely is. We do one of these business process design engagements almost every time we sell Loki BPM. So we have this learning loop. We're always learning new things, and everybody does things differently. So we're always accruing new material and updating material on this stuff. Keep the personas. It's just on a simple Google Doc that all our guys have access to. Some people want to edit it, some people aren't, but they make comments. So it comes back to that thing of broadcasting, making this stuff very visible and very accessible to everybody. That's a lot of the success comes down to little teeny things and making this stuff easy for everybody to work together. So this is a little more detailed example. This is a page from our Loki Portals product that we call the dashboard. So in this service design work that we were doing, which is very virtuous in terms of our development of the user experience we put on our Portals products, we learned that most of the people at the end customer site who actually did all these self-care things that everybody wanted to have happen. The customer likes it, they don't want to call up. The operator, Verizon, loves it, they don't want people calling them. It was really administrator, so the business owner at a small business or the IT person at a bigger business that was actually doing this stuff. That was one thing we learned. The second thing we learned was it was usually 6 to 9 months after they got their new cloud telephony service in their office before they actually went in and did everything. And we really had this problem of too much stuff in low-key portals because our end customers were selling these big enterprises. They were like, no, we've got to have every little hook and dial in here. So we were working with this tyranny of too many choices all the time. How do we nest this stuff and organize it so it's workable? But it was always like 3 or 4, even when we did a really good job, it was like 2 to 3 clicks for these customers to go find something. And, we all have the guts to say, oops, sorry, this isn't working. These guys are bailing on self-care. And the numbers that we should be seeing on self-care are not there. We and our customers, we all had the kind of, not all of us, but enough of us had the gumption to, sort of disprove that assumption that putting in this portal is going to create a great self-care experience. We acknowledge that. And so what we did was we created a new page called Dashboards, and we got the 80th to 90th percentile of everything that the user wanted to do on a single page. Not 100%, but 80 to 90%. So we were, everything was in there still because that had to be the case. But we condensed it down and we created this other interface. And this has been tremendously successful. I mean, this has drastically changed the self-care numbers for our operators because their customer admins needed a more dense, a friendlier, simpler jumping in point to actually engage in self-care. So another thing we did was, receptionists, power users at an office, they have these very particular configurations they want to have on their phones. This is kind of a problem scenario, which is a good place to start when you're developing user stories, because you want to make sure you're not just sort of writing your own sort of self-actualizing user story. So you can see a couple of user stories here. One, they want to have a great out-of-the-box experience. We all want that, right? We want it tailored to us to the greatest degree possible. And 2, they want to be able to change stuff. So, okay, well, the relatively obvious thing that we did was build a visual representation of the phone that they could twiddle and change around and make that work. Okay, so simple enough. But the interesting thing was our competitors and a couple of our partners had built the stuff and they kind of imploded, blew up, just didn't work. They were not able to validate several key assumptions for this thing to be operationally tenable that I'll go over in a minute. So we laid out a set of user stories and we paired them with test cases. And a couple of examples are, on this out-of-the-box thing, we looked beyond the obvious persona of the end user to, okay, well, they want to have a good out-of-the-box experience. Who's going to create those templates that the operator uses to decide what that out-of-the-box experience is? Well, that's going to be a product manager, and they may be non-technical, or even if they are, they probably don't have access to the actual innards of our application to edit an XML file or do something like that. So we need to have a GUI for them too, so they can create the templates. Okay, this is not like earth-shaking stuff, but it's attention to these little persona-driven details that has really made the difference for us on the sale of software. Another example is as a receptionist, I want to be able to change the buttons on my phone. Well, let's make sure they can reset those back to their baseline state. This is just a very kind of housekeeping example of how you would pair a story with a test case. Because there's this idea of, how many of you are familiar with the idea of safe exploration in UX? Okay, so there's the basic idea is you always want to assure the user that they can't break it. They can always get back to home base and they're going to be okay. So they should try to use the product, the page, whatever it is. So this is what that thing ultimately looked like. And the reason I picked this particular example is really, and we're going to come back to it when we go through the planning section, is that it's it wasn't the next Facebook, it wasn't even a new company or really a new product. It was a line extension. So I think it's a good example of how you can take this stuff and actually apply it incrementally to a product you've already got, to a line extension, a new feature you're thinking about doing. We talked a lot about understanding the user and so forth. I think that you do that, and then the other pillar of design thinking is creativity. It's still important to look at your ecosystem. We do that all the time. So we, for instance, wouldn't have been able to build Loki portals without this new data structure that existed on the host platform, Broadworks. We wouldn't have been able to build Loki DPM until Sugar and Salesforce matured their third-party developer facilities to the point that they are now. So we do keep an eye on these things, and they do create opportunities, but they really should be driven by these other ideas about how to understand your user. So in summary on ideation, I think that the real point is there's a tremendous opportunity to use this stuff in B2B. I think that, well, how many of you are in infrastructure and network? A whole bunch of you, right? I mean, look at Cisco. They innovated early on with routing, speeds and feeds, very technical stuff. But I would actually say that their most enduring and economically valuable innovation is their training program. They have like almost complete thought control over IP switching and routing because they created this training franchise, and that was not a bits and bytes, that was not a speeds and feeds decision. That was an understanding of their users, how they interact with their employers and their organizations. So I think it's just a good example of, I would have called that probably an active design thinking, how they came to that conclusion. I would guess that it's, any of you guys work at Cisco? Yep. Is that exactly how it happened?
I'm only recently there, but I'm working in their training organization.
You are? Well, it's a great part of their business. So I think, in summary, that there are great opportunities to do this stuff, and it's very practical. So on planning, this is an important thing if you're working in a mature company. At Lena, we have hypotheses. So we lay out the set of assumptions that we did, for example, with visual device management. We haven't yet ascertained a product market fit. We also maintain a set of theses. So just because we validated an assumption at one point doesn't mean it's going to stay valid forever. Especially in high tech, it's a very dynamic environment. Things change all the time. So we do keep these, and it's actually a very lightweight strategy management tool. It's, again, very visible to everybody and easy to understand. And so we're always keeping an eye on things that we found to be true that made us want to be in this business. Are they still true? To what degree are they true? Are there other things that have come to be more significant? So I think it's a tool you can use with both new and mature products. So let's go over a few of the assumptions this is the assumption set, or a big part of it that we use when we did this visual device management tool. So the first one is, do people want this at all? And actually, we didn't have to validate this. We're kind of lucky in that regard. Some of our partners had already created prototypes and early market versions, so we actually knew already there was a big amount of latent demand for this. So that was a big leap forward. Another assumption is, if our customers give the end user this capability, is it actually going to help the situation? Are the end users going to use it, or are they going to break things all the time and end up calling customer care even more than they would have before? Because it's a totally invalid outcome. They wouldn't want to do it if that was the case. To prove that out, we just had to go into beta testing with our customers. But we did do that before we replicated this on a massive scale. So we didn't give this stuff to our whole sales team and say, go sell this. We made sure that we did that first, and that involved. How many of you guys are familiar with the idea of a minimum viable product? Okay, so I mean that is super important for being able to do this, right? Because if you can't do that, if you can't pare things down, you're not going, your time frame's not going to work, right? If it takes you a year to get this thing out the door, you're not going to be able to beta test and revise it and come back in. You have to be able to pare things down and get them out the door quickly. The second thing was kind of one version back on this on supportability. If our customers were breaking things all the time and calling us, that wasn't going to be tenable for us economically. So we need to make sure that we validated a bit in the lab with those customers, that they were able to use this stuff, and then we validated at scale. The next thing was pricing, and then these next set of things here are, at least at Lena, we use number one means this is an existential assumption. If we can't validate this, we should not build this product. And then everything following that is kind of tactical detail of some sort. So let's loop through this whole idea of iterative management as it applies to this module that we built. We believe that there was this capability that everybody wanted, and we believe that the thing was going to be compelling, it was going to be supportable for both our customers and for us, and we designed a series of experiments in the labs of our customers, and then in limited beta release to validate those things. They actually were validated, all the existential ones. So we said, okay, great, let's go put this in a box and sell it to as many people as we can, and it worked, everybody likes it, it's been a great thing for us. I think that, one thing that, as you're working through these assumptions, a lot of these assumptions early on have to do with, is somebody going to buy this? And if so, who? And if they buy it, who's then going to buy it? And I think that there's an assumption that if things are good, they'll go viral, and that's actually usually not the way things work. A lot of things that were regarded as viral successes, like Facebook's a good example, were actually very carefully orchestrated, and it's certainly not a good way to look at formulating your assumptions. So you probably all familiar with the Jeff Moore technology adoption lifecycle, right? It's kind of a meat and potatoes thing out here. I think that that's still very applicable, and I like it, and we kind of use it, but I think it was more applicable when buying something was more about these big, high-stakes technology decisions, buying a particular piece of hardware on standard A versus standard B. When you look at cloud services and apps and things like that, your level of commitment is not zero, but it's much, much lower. So I actually really like billiards as a way of thinking about customer acquisition. I'm not a great player, but the first thing I learned after I learned how to hit the ball was, it's not about getting the one ball in. You have to look at where you're leaving the cue ball, white ball, for your next shot. So let's say you have an application, and you're going to sell it to kids who listen to Snoop Dogg and soccer moms. Well, these people spend a lot of time in minivans together, but they don't want to buy the same thing, especially kids, right? So you have to look at, you may not be like this, right? I mean, you're buying your product may not be this huge, gigantic commitment, and if it's not, you're going to need to look at this stuff on more of a sociological basis, on more of a pin A knocks down pin B kind of basis. I find that helpful. We're going to go through the business model canvas, which I think is new to most of you for Lean. So there are 9 elements to the business model canvas. The first one is customer segments. We have 3 customer segments in Lean, large incumbent operators like Verizon. These guys usually own copper plant or cable plant in a certain area. Then we have medium operators, people like level 3 that have some particular competitive advantage. And then small niche folks, sometimes they have their own application they sell, and they sell cloud communication services alongside that. On value propositions, we've come to learn that reducing, and this was a great thing as a management team for us to arrive at together, reducing time to market and the risk to get new stuff to market is the most important thing that we do for our customers. So yeah, we reduce cost and we help them implement best practices, but most importantly, we help them get things to market more reliably and quicker than they could before, which is really important because their landscape's changing a lot. We do almost all our sales now through channels, and that's important because these big operators require dedicated personal assistants, which is part of our customer relationship rubric, and that's a lot of salespeople for us. So we, early on, recognize for the business that it's crucial we cannot sell this stuff to these people on a large scale, especially the big ones. So that's a good example of kind of where putting these things down on paper helps you recognize the critical linkages between them. On key resources, actionable insight on what's working in the space is our most important thing. Development, operations are very important, but that insight is really what our customers are ultimately paying for versus our competitors. Product development, systems design, those are our big activities, and then our key partners are really our subsystems that we work with, like BroadSoft, resellers, integrators. We've worked really, really hard again because of our size to create good opportunities for third parties to come build things on top of our products, take those to market. And cost structure, we have pretty typical software cost structure you guys are familiar with. So let's take a quick look at how this shook out in our financial results. Revenue-wise, we started the business doing consulting, then we did a little bit of software on a success basis, and then since really 2009, we've been scaling up the software business, and we kept our expenses very minimal and very, very flexible and fungible while we were validating that software business before we really decided that was the thing that we wanted to scale. That allowed us to avoid any kind of venture financing, having to spend time on that. And we've always been profitable. And our visibility was, this is an interesting thing because this is really the key thing that changed for us over the course of our lifetime. Our visibility was very moderate in the beginning. It was relatively good. We had a consulting business, we get a gig, we hire a guy, or a woman. Then it was low to moderate as we were doing the software stuff. That was something where we were changing the business. We kind of didn't know exactly how it was going to shake out, but we never put the company at risk. And then it grew, and now it's now for our new stuff it's high, and then for add-on things it's it's moderate to low depending on the thing. Organizationally, we started off, it was just me. I brought in contractors, was how we got our software products built, people I knew usually. And again, that falls in that rubric of let's not build a big dev organization, not that we had the means to anyway, before we validated this is going to work. As we scaled, we brought in development management and operations management, and then as we've gotten even bigger, we've expanded senior management and gotten much more specialized, functionally delineated, process driven. So I think that so I get asked a lot, do I need to learn how to code? Like, what's the best way for me to actually become more engaged in my business? I actually think that these foundation concepts that we've talked about today are a great place to start. I think that probably most of you in your roles have this. I think a lot of you probably have an engineering background. But I think basic technical literacy, do you understand the model view controller framework? Do you understand the difference between a plugin and an API type of integration? Do you understand the roles and systems in a technical team? This is what I usually coach founders that are non-engineers, that they should make sure they understand it. I think it's very feasible to understand these things at least at a high level. I think understanding Agile is great. I think probably most of you are familiar with that. And then I advise people to get into specifics. So from a self-development standpoint in the organization, this is what I usually recommend to the folks that I work with. So the last side of development, at Lean, we practice Agile. We have a couple different products, and they have dependencies. We manage that through the cycles. That's one nuance we have. And then we actually do have some predictive content, subsystems we need to keep up with. So we actually have a mix of kind of adaptive and predictive content. And the key thing is just to make sure that we leave ourselves as much of that adaptive headroom as we possibly can. Because even though our customers say, well, we'd love to see a one-year plan, when they come to us with an idea that they want to be able to implement in a few months, that's what they really value. It's about really prioritizing what you want out of the program. So the last thing we're going to look at here is, I promised that you walk out of here with the ability to actually go do these things. And there's a template here that you can use that we're going to review that allows you to actually get a jump on these things and do them. So first you have the learning rubric, and what you're going to be doing is direct observation, online research, maybe some prototyping, and then you'll have the field notes. And so if we take a look at this template here, which is at this web address, it's free, you can download it. It's certainly not the only way to do this, but I think it's pretty handy, and we developed it to support these sort of things. If you go down to this section, where do we look for answers? You can see here, there's a series, these questions are for an example company called Enable Quiz. That's a synthetic company that's building an application for technical quizzing. So all these examples that you see in this template are built around them. But I think that these objectives here are a good initial checklist for thinking about, okay, I'm going to go talk to a bunch of customers. What do I want to find out from them? I think that these are good organizing heuristic to go and figure that out. If we go to the next item that we talked about here, the desire to go out and do the design, you'll see that in the document there are a series of personas, problem scenarios, and user stories in this template. I would say that's what you do when you've got your field research done and you're ready to start actually distilling these things into a set of what are effectively recommendations about what you believe about your marketplace. And if you go here to this template and you go to the top, you can see that there are example personas in here. Who are the users? And I think one of the most important things about developing these personas is, again, photos, descriptions, subtle little details about what these people do and how they act. Remember, every iPhone is a video camera and camera now. These things will really, really help, especially when you think about going and taking these things and working with your colleagues on it. Because a lot of this stuff is not just about you yourself being able to understand these things, but it's about being able to describe it to your colleagues. Has anybody ever heard the story from Made to Stick about the tapping experiment they did at UC San Diego? This is a great story, and it's a great thing to think about as you're actually going and you're compiling all this stuff. They did an experiment where one person would sit on one side of the table and tap out a song, like Happy Birthday, Row, Row Your Boat. Another person would sit on the other side of the table and listen, and they were supposed to guess what that song was. And the interesting result was that something like 70% of the tappers, the people making the song, thought that the person had understood what they tapped out. But only like 10% of the people actually understood the song. And I think that that's one of the more interesting things about doing this stuff is to keep in mind that you may go out and you may see these people and you may get it, you may get what your firm should do as a result, but a lot of the actual practice of design thinking has to do with doing a good job of describing it for other people. And that's what this template is an effort at, helping you organize for that. There are also user stories down at the bottom here. I think you're all pretty familiar with those. And then there's also a set of problem scenarios that you'll find towards the end. And I think it's just interesting that you may find, even if you are familiar with user stories, that there is a way to.
Can you go back to the link when you're done?
Yeah, I will. It's part of the plan. The interesting thing about it that you may find here is the way that these things are kind of threaded together and interrelate to each other. So, in fact, yes, with that, I'll go up and I'll post the link for you guys. You can also go to alexandercowan.com and you'll find it there. It's but if you want to take a second to write that down, go ahead. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do is a little bit of an experiment. So unless you're scared or creeped out by the person sitting next to you, close your eyes for a second. You're scared? Okay. So think about the ideas we talked about around design thinking. Is there a way next week that you can go and apply this to something you're working on at work? What about the idea of iterative management, of laying out your assumptions for the thing that you're working on and using those as the focal point to figure out what you ought to do? What about organization? Is there a way that you can organize teams to go out and ascertain these things that you need to figure out about new products that would work within the organization a little bit better? All right, you open your eyes. That was it for that. There are a couple other things that you might enjoy if you're in apps, B2C. There's a couple examples on /speaking of one is about an apps company called Pheasant. Another one is about a non-tech business, the Penny Ice Creamer, where they apply these ideas. This is my Twitter. This is my blog. If you're interested in working with your colleagues to apply these ideas, I do a series of workshops called New Product Improv that are there. And I would love to hear from anybody about what they thought of the talk. If you end up reading the book or any of the stuff on the website, I always love to hear from people that are actually going out and doing these things. Also, if you're interested in having somebody speak to your organization about this stuff or a group that you're in, I'm available. I'm great at kids' birthday parties as well. I do it for free. So that's it. Thanks a lot, and we'll take questions now. Question? Yes.
Something which is well laid out this
Uh-huh.
something very interesting that while you do most of the sales workshops, how do you maintain the relationship with the customer?
That's a good question. We
Question.
so yeah, good idea. The question was, we do a lot of our sales through channels. How do we maintain the relationship with the customer? How do we go actually do all this stuff? It is mostly a transactional relationship. So we're, they own the deal, but we still going in there and doing the actual, nitty-gritty implementation and so forth. In our particular case, I think that's always a challenge with the channel. Other questions?
So do you know people who attended your talks, workshops of this type, gone out and actually applied maybe the whole process?
Yeah.
and build something, build a company, and, or transform their company or transform their department? Or do you have any examples of well-known examples? Or,
It's a good question. A lot of them are startups, so none of them are particularly well known yet. And the big companies I work with, they don't like to talk about this kind of thing. So I don't have any good example. That's why I use Leonid. I use the Penny Ice Creamery, and then I use a synthetic example. It gives me more, continuity on these things, because I'm either not able to, most, it's high tech, a lot of people are relatively secretive about what they're doing until they're really big.
well, I have a follow-up question. So, when I was consulting, I was be a management consultant. I found that for my clients, their customers were always would get excited if we built a story around how this company is actually producing their products or creating products. Would that apply in this case too? For example, would enterprise customers find it interesting or valuable to know how you're actually building products?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why I did the example of Leonid, because it's my own company. I can talk about it however much I want. So, for B2B stuff, that's my most kind of facile example that I'm able to use, because we actually really do every single one of these things, and we're able to disclose about it and talk about it however much we want, or however much I want. Other questions? Yes.
I wondered if you could talk about communication. I've always done user stories, but then business stakeholders are like, I need a PRD to understand the whole product, like what are we actually building, because they don't want to go through the stories, right?
Mhm.
And then on the other side with the engineers, they're not focused on documentation, they're focused on building software. So when you bring in new engineers, there's like no guidebook of like what we've created, right? So
Right. Well, so there's kind of, you sort of have a before the fact and an after the fact thing there, yeah. I think that, well, I can tell you what we do with Leonid. When we started with story, we have an architecture team that consumes personas and stories and produces design details for implementation. So in that sense, we have what they would call in Agile, I guess, an architecture spike. And so they produce specs that these guys use, and then that we ultimately use as inputs into product documentation. Agile says we value collaboration over documentation. Doesn't necessarily mean there's no documentation.
yeah, I guess in the startups I've worked in, there's not. Like you're just so focused on getting the product out.
Yeah, but that's and believe me, we live that at Leonid for sure. And I it's kind of one of those things like the tortoise and the hare type situation. I mean and we get the question, can I really spend time on design thinking? I don't have time for a lot of research. I mean, how can you not spend time on it? What's expensive is, it's that whole thing of people like to measure their efficiency locally. If we work really hard and we get a product out the door, we feel good about that. But if it was the wrong product, it was sort of a waste of time. So I think, Leonid, what we found a good, solid compromise was, and it wasn't a compromise, it was just the right thing to do. Not a big believer in compromises in this regard. Was that we write what are called functional descriptions. So they're mostly initially composed of personas and stories, and test cases. Right? We do those. They're very important, and quite a lot of the detail ends up being in those. And then we, our architecture people, if things complicated, will go and detail it out. We also use Balsamiq a lot for mock-ups, prototyping. It's a very good tool for the next step. So, and that may or may not be appropriate for what you're doing. But so we do that, get the design done, then we use that as an input into documentation. Because as an enterprise software company, we have to have documentation. Yeah. So that gets consumed by, the people that work up the documentation. We're usually the people out working with the customers in our case. Just makes more sense. They have their hands on the customer, and it's sort of their tool. So we divvy their time out to do documentation. We've never had a lot of luck with a dedicated documentation person. You just end up spending so much time them talking to the implementer or the people in the know and spending money on them. And so that's what we do with Lean, for example. But I think, writing stories, making the personas who've been collecting that data is I think, worth doing for pretty much everybody.
you talked about minimum viable product as pushing out to your betas, just to get that feedback. How far beyond the minimum viable product did you push before you decided, okay, it's really time to launch this? Or can you comment on making that decision?
It varied for a lot of cases. I think that not very far. Like for example, we have a business layer product. It's our biggest product because while we built it on top of an application platform, Sugar CRM and then Salesforce, that does a lot of this stuff. They required a lot of modifications and certain parts of it kind of being taken out and replaced to make it all work. And when we did that on Sugar CRM, we kind of built the whole thing in the beginning because the idea was a kind of slotted in greenfield kind of product you start using. With Salesforce, that worked okay, and we decided not to repeat that with Salesforce. So there we're doing modules. So instead of let's say our first incarnation of BPM has modules A through H, we're going and we're kind of cherry picking module D. We're putting that out to the market and seeing how it does as an individual atomic thing. And that's actually worked out. In that particular example, that's actually worked out a lot better for us in terms of how do we get validation, how do we get money in tandem with our investments in this stuff. But I would say take whatever you think is the minimum viable product and cut it in half again and figure out how you do that. That's usually the rule. It's just so hard to remove. But that's often what a successful design process is really about, reduction.
At least it helps the UI.
Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
My question is around the pricing with the early customers. So let's say you're trying to still figure out what features the product should have.
Right.
Let's say it's it's an online service, you charge $5 a month, and you're trying to get the first couple of customers.
Mm-hmm.
And psychologically, you can't say, initially I'm going to charge $5 and then make it $20.
Like our early guys, they got their screaming deal and they get to keep it pretty much. I think different things work in different situations, but by and large, I think those people have taken a big risk to use your stuff, and that's their reward. Is they get to keep that price. I think typically that's what I think.
So you wouldn't go with this is what our price is going to be, and the benefit you get from this relationship will be your features will be in the product. If you can make that work, make it work, absolutely. But and the other thing you can do, a lot of this depends on the sales, but you can also invert that, right? You'd be like, look, we're gonna do this basic minimum product. It's gonna have X, Y, and Z. Guess what? The thing you're paying for it actually has A and B and F as well. So you got an awesome deal. Okay, now we're making another product, the premium version. Okay, you can have that if you want, but you can't have it at that same price. I think it really depends on your sales situation, but that's a way to kind of flip that around. And it probably is a little easier in practice in most cases, I would guess. Certainly that's what we did. And it was very square for everybody. There was some kicking and screaming, but overall I think everybody felt like it's reasonable. All right, I'll come find. You want one more?
All right, yeah, let's do one more and wrap it up.
Yeah, one more.
One more.
Okay, how did you incentivize your partners to prefer your product over your competitions, or was there much competition when your go-to-market strategy?
There was a lot of competition. There weren't a lot of people, because it's not a space like that, but there's big incumbent competitors. We executed better. They didn't. We sold the stuff ourselves, and then they decided to sell it after the fact. So we didn't go. We didn't get them to sell it initially. We had to do it ourselves in the early period. And I think that's very advisable for most people. Having to depend on a channel when you're doing all this stuff for the first time is. I wouldn't want to do it. I would make the channel want this stuff. Get your first few customers yourself. Okay. Thank you.